In the 1970s and beyond, Karl Weick was writing about loose and tight coupling in organizations. Weick builds on systems theory, especially this notion of interdependence, where the parts of a system are mutually reliant. Weick uses this idea of interdependence as a jumping off place for the terms loose and tight coupling, which describe degrees of interdependence. In other words, how loose or tight are the parts of a system connected. Coupling simply means how people and work are linked. The parts, people, and elements of any system are interconnected or coupled. Those connections differ in the strength of their intensity. Tight coupling, for example, describes how connections are strong, how the component parts of a system are directly dependent on one another. A change in one area necessarily changes other areas, and the influence of these parts is immediate, constant, and significant. In other words, things are tightly coupled. They're fit together so that if you bump one area of an organization, the other area feels the jolt. Centralization is one of the elements of a tightly coupled system where it's really obvious, where communication, work processes, and decision-making authority often must flow through central hubs in the organization, and little gets done without the direct involvement from specific people in fixed organizational roles. That's centralization. For example, you may have noticed if you've ever been in an organizational hierarchy that was tightly coupled and had a centralized decision-making process, that maybe you as a frontline worker had a thing that you wanted to talk to somebody else about in the other part of the organization. But to do so, you had to go through your supervisor, and they'd go through his or her supervisor and so forth until you reached the other person. You couldn't necessarily go directly. You had to go through this centralized communication system. However, if your supervisor, for whatever reason, was out sick, didn't see your idea as a high priority, wasn't equipped to handle it, nobody in that line of communication was working on that project. It's a little bit like when you line up dominoes. If you tip over one domino by accident, all the others will fall down. And all the dominoes fall down and nobody's doing any work. So a tightly coupled or centralized system can work very well when things are running smoothly and there are no problems. However, when there are problems, the issue will often cascade through the organization and cause everybody problems. For example, a t-shirt printing business is a good illustration of how this happens. An actual student of mine used to work at a small business where they printed t-shirts. And what he said was that there was one person that designed the t-shirt and worked with the client. The next person in the line formatted everything and set up the ink so it would print the proper way. The third person did the actual printing, and the last person in line did the packaging and shipping of the product once it was all done. The student said that frequently the person who was supposed to be in charge of the formatting and the ink would call in sick for whatever reason, and the result was that nobody else down the line was able to do their work. This is a centralized system, a tightly coupled system, and I said to the student, well, what would happen when that person in line would call in sick? And my student said the boss would send everybody home. Tightly coupled systems work great when everything's working, but they collapse when there's a problem. So loose coupling is an alternative or a different way to connect or organize an organization where the parts of a system, people, and work are connected, but those dependencies are weak, not as essential compared to a tightly coupled organization. The flow of work is designed to be flexible, and the mutual influence of organizational areas is reduced so work can continue when problems occur. So for example, in a t-shirt printing business, maybe you cross-train everybody so that if any one person is out sick for whatever reason, the work can continue. Weick continues that loosely coupled parts of an organization are attached and elements are responsive. In other words, they're not completely disconnected. However, and this is a big however, these elements retain evidence of separateness and identity. Loosely coupled parts do affect other parts, but the influence tends to be negligible, occasional, indirect, and eventual. These are counterpoints to the tightly coupled influences that we saw earlier. Weick wrote about this in his 1990 article with Orton in Academy of Management Review. So the centralization then becomes a decentralization. So let's say you're looking at a college campus, and on your schedule for that week, you have a variety of different classes in different departments. Well, these would not really be connected. You go to different places for each of these classes. And let's say that for 1 week, the English department completely shut down. Maybe everybody's got the flu. Maybe the faculty and staff are all at a conference. For whatever reason, all those classes are canceled. Well, the other departments will still continue to do their work. They're decentralized. They're not directly dependent upon each other. You would, however, notice some differences. For example, there might be slightly more parking spaces available. You might have more time to hang out with some of your friends or study between your classes because your English classes are canceled. However, life would go on pretty much without interference in the other departmental areas. There are advantages to decentralizing or a loosely coupled organization, as Weick would say. So K through 12 schools are a good example of loosely coupled organizations. Universities, of course. Hospitals, where you have different areas of the hospital doing different types of work, and maybe radiology shuts down, but everything else continues without incident. Police organizations are great examples of loosely coupled systems. You can have one police officer call in sick and it doesn't matter, they adapt. You might also have different kinds of police departments overlapping. So you might have a sheriff, a local village police office. You might have the state police, and they all overlap and assist each other when needed. Judicial systems are another example that Weick provides. So the concepts of loose and tight coupling are an excellent example of how Karl Weick builds on systems theory and articulates a slightly more specific concept than just regular old interdependence. He gives us a range of how those parts are interdependent, how they're related, and how they influence each other.